It's my pleasure to welcome you to our program. Through Dennis and Susan Shapiro's vision and generosity, the Shapiro Center for American History and Culture at the Huntington was established in 2019. While the words vision and generosity are very accurate to describe the Shapiros as donors, they don't quite capture what this gift means to us at the Huntington and to the Shapiros. The satisfaction of knowing that one's lifelong passions have found the right stewards of the flame. We're very thankful that Dennis, Susan, and members of their family are here with us for today's event. It provides another occasion for us to express our gratitude for a gift that transforms the way we conduct historical and cultural studies at the Huntington. The Shapiro Center's goal is to advance scholarship, interpretation, and understanding of the American past. We've been thrilled that the Shapiros' own rare collection of documents, particularly related to American presidential administrations from the 18th to the 20th centuries, have joined the Huntington's own extensive collections in this field. But in providing the resources to endow the center, Dennis and Susan also wanted to ensure that through a series of exhibits, programs, events, and a book prize, these historical documents would be brought to life. The center's launch last October did just that. In Professor Annette Gordon-Reed's inaugural lecture, The Past in the Present, America's Founding and Us, she addressed particularly pressing issues for all of us today. How American history measures its people and movements, including our founders. Her talk was both provocative and nuanced and set a great tone for the work of our center. So today we celebrate another exciting first, a lecture delivered by the winner of the first Shapiro Book Prize, which is awarded for an outstanding scholarly book, the first scholarly book, that's important, in American political, social, intellectual, or cultural history that makes exceptional use of primary materials. So to introduce our awardee, I'll turn things over to our own Steve Hindle, W.M. Keck Foundation Director of Research at the Huntington.
Thank you so much, Karen, and welcome everybody to the virtual Huntington. It's my pleasure and privilege this evening to introduce the winner of the inaugural Shapiro Center Book Prize, Professor Benjamin Francis-Fallon, author of The Latino Vote, A History, published by Harvard University Press in 2019. This remarkable book rose to the top of a pile of some 60 volumes nominated by their publishers and assessed by a prize committee consisting of Professors Beverly Gage from Yale University, Tara Hunter from Princeton, and Peter Mankell from USC. Fittingly, given the terms of reference of the prize, to which Karen referred, The Rise of the Latino Vote is a deeply researched, cogently written, and topical volume, described by Professor Hunter as an especially profound and necessary book, addressing an issue of great contemporary relevance. In my role as Director of Research, I get to make many very happy phone calls, especially when awarding fellowships, but the telephone conversation with Ben Francis-Fallon was truly special. As the news of his success sunk in, he explained that as a junior scholar, you work in isolation for so long without any clue that anybody will be at all interested in your project. And then something remarkable like this happens. Well, Ben, we genuinely hope that this award is career transforming for such a promising young historian. More formally, Benjamin Francis-Fallon is Associate Professor of History and Director of Social Sciences Education at Western Carolina University, where he has taught since 2014. He holds his first degree from Cornell and his MA and PhD from Georgetown. He's held fellowships from the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at the American University in Washington, DC, at Cornell University and at the Clements Center for Southwestern Studies at Southern Methodist University. He's the author of a number of scholarly articles on the politics and economics of Latino identity and of fascinating op-eds which have recently appeared in the Washington Post and the LA Times, and I recommend the latter in particular very highly to you. The Rise of the Latino Vote is, of course, his first book, and it is my honor to invite him to discuss it this evening. As is usual for our Zoom webinar programs, the speaker has pre-recorded his talk, but we will handle the Q&A live. I know there are hundreds of you out there all across the US and beyond, so please do not hesitate to use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen to submit questions, and I will moderate the discussion after we have heard the talk. Please welcome Professor Benjamin Francis-Fallon.
Thank you, Steve, for your generous introduction. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to just take a moment to say how incredibly honored I am to be receiving the inaugural Shapiro Book Prize. Like all books, this one has been a journey, and I began researching what became the rise of the Latino vote in 2007. For the next decade and more, including countless days spent alone in an archive or at a computer, I had no idea if anyone would ever care about what I had to say about this topic. So this award brings a remarkable sense of validation. I offer my deepest thanks to the Shapiro family for their extraordinary generosity in establishing the prize and their thoughtfulness in designating it a first book award. I'm also grateful to Steve Hindle, Catherine Weary Miller, and all those at the Huntington who worked so hard to coordinate the competition. In addition, I'm indebted to the panel of esteemed scholars they assembled to serve as judges. I cannot thank them enough for their careful engagement with my work. The book they judged, too, would have been far lesser without the foundational guidance provided by my wise and caring graduate mentor, Michael Kazin. And none of this would have been possible without the unflagging support of my wife, Liz Kimienti, who gave so much of her time, intellect, and love to make this book a success. She shares this honor as well. Now, like many of you, I'm still trying to make sense of the 2020 elections. This was the year that Latinos became the largest minority electorate, surpassing African Americans. We learned that Latinos played a major part of deciding critical states like Florida for Donald Trump. On the other hand, we learned that Latinos were pivotal in shifting Arizona to the Democratic Party. And then there was the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, long a Mexican American and Democratic stronghold that also shifted hard in the direction of Trump. The results led many commentators to declare their realization that Latino voters were not a monolith. This revelation of Latino political diversity in 2020 unsettled traditional ways of imagining Latino voters. For the longest time, analysts have talked about Hispanics or Latinos as being on the cusp of achieving a major collective breakthrough, one that would upend the country's political system. Take Univision anchor Jorge Ramos's January 2020 op-ed in the New York Times, which spoke of a population set to determine the outcome in November. It was this way in 2012, too, when Time magazine promised to explain why Latinos will pick the next president. How long have Latinos borne the burden of these extraordinary expectations? One can look back to October of 1978. This Time magazine cover story declared, just as Black power was a reality of the 1960s, so the quest for Latino power may well become a political watchword in the 1980s. According to Time, the 80s would be this group's turn in the sun. This persistent view of a singular Latino community poised to tip the scales of power in America raised questions that I explored in the book, questions I'll be speaking about tonight. The first is, how did the diverse US populations of Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and other US residents of Latin American origin actually come to be seen as one political community? And second, how have people tried to mobilize voters around a shared Hispanic or Latino identity? That is, how have they tried to generate a sense of Latino peoplehood and then use it to wield political power? I should pause for a second to talk about names. The people I discuss in the book sometimes describe themselves by national origin, Mexican American or Puerto Rican or Cuban. Other times they use pan-ethnic terms like Spanish speaking, Spanish surnamed, and of course, Hispanic or Latino. For some people, these terms were interchangeable. But whenever possible, I refer to individuals and the peoples for whom they spoke by the terms they themselves used at that time. Now, having cleared the air about names, the first point I want to make is that the Latino vote was hardly a natural occurrence. Rather, it was painstakingly built over decades. Indeed, as late as 1960, the people now said to comprise the Latino vote rarely claimed to be a single community, political or otherwise. Ethnic Mexicans in the Southwest lived in distinct political communities. They pursued power in places as varied as Los Angeles, the mountains of northern New Mexico, the border counties of South Texas. Each place nurtured in them separate ethnic orientations and political outlooks. They didn't see themselves as the same. These were self-described Spanish Americans in New Mexico, Latin Americans in Texas, and Mexican Americans in California. And they made only occasional attempts at political unification, even in the years after World War II. When they did, their meetings often collapsed before they even got started because they could seldom agree on what to call themselves. On the East Coast, Puerto Ricans and Cubans arrived in great numbers following World War II, transforming New York City and Miami respectively. But they had their own homelands, political priorities, and deeply held identities. Nor did the federal government recognize these various peoples as a collective. Into the late 1960s, US Census officials classified most Mexican Americans and mainland Puerto Ricans as regional subsets of the country's white population. This image portrays the federal government's knowledge, or lack thereof, of the Mexican American population in 1970. Note the question marks when we get beyond the Southwest. As far as Washington was concerned, this really was a regional people. For those who might wish to unite Mexican Americans with Puerto Ricans in the Northeast or Cubans in the Southeast to pursue a common agenda, they were hamstrung by a lack of hard data as to their numbers, their location, and their condition. In short, the Latino vote did not exist before 1960 because, at least as a subject of national political analysis and policy conversation, the Latino did not meaningfully exist. And the Latino did not yet exist because the Latino vote did not yet exist. They were created together. The outline of a Latino vote first appeared in the presidential campaign of 1960. In August of that year, Los Angeles was playing host to the Democratic National Convention that nominated John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson to lead the party ticket. Among the small handful of Mexican American convention delegates was a 44-year-old LA City councilman named Edward Ross Roybal. Eager to shine a spotlight on Mexican Americans and their issues, Roybal and his allies convinced Kennedy that a coordinated Mexican American campaign effort could boost the fortunes of the Democratic Party. Thus were born the Viva Kennedy clubs. Members of this parallel campaign effort included elected officials, civil rights leaders, and grassroots activists. Hitting the campaign trail, they highlighted how Kennedy's concern for the poor could uplift their struggling communities. And they offered their services as expert ethnic allies in Kennedy's quest to fight communism in Cuba and across Latin America. Viva Kennedy campaigners believed that a strong Mexican American vote in the presidential election would win them powerful allies in Washington. They expected those allies to bring federal resources to bear on their people's unique needs. But they also wanted Washington Democrats to back them in their power struggles with their state and local Democratic parties. Since at least the coming of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, Mexican Americans had been loyal Democrats. But then as now, they complained that their party regularly took them for granted. Now, while rooted in the Southwest, Viva Kennedy soon included Puerto Ricans as well. The once small New York Puerto Rican community had grown rapidly since World War II, enough to be seen as a potential difference maker in what was then the largest electoral college state. The image here shows this historic collaboration of Mexican Americans from the Southwest and New York Puerto Ricans united in support of Kennedy. In such moments, Viva Kennedy enshrined the presidential campaign as the central ritual in the creation of a Latino political identity. And Latinos were crucial to Kennedy's historically narrow margin of victory over Vice President Richard Nixon. Puerto Rican turnout in New York exploded in the 1960 election. And in Texas especially, Mexican Americans played a decisive role. They turned out 9-1 for the Democrats, supplying a 200,000 vote margin in a state Kennedy and Johnson carried by only a quarter of that. In fact, JFK's percentage of Mexican American votes surpassed his percentage among every other electoral group, including the Irish. Yet despite this image, Southwesterners and New Yorkers rarely interacted during the campaign. And Kennedy had little desire to face a united Latino constituency once in office. He worked to demobilize his backers soon after his election. And without the collective focus of the Viva Kennedy campaign, Puerto Rican and Mexican American leaders largely went their separate ways. The image of a nationwide political bloc was just that, an image. However, a handful of Viva Kennedy campaigners, elected officials, capitalized upon their activism to ascend in the political arena. Most importantly, Edward Roybal won election to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1962. He became the first Mexican American from California to join the House since the 19th century. Roybal enjoyed President Kennedy's campaign endorsement, but there was always a transaction. For Democratic elites, the rise of Roybal and other Mexican Americans to Congress was to be taken as evidence of Democratic Party progress, now radiating outward to this next group of formerly excluded Americans. Thanks to Roybal and fellow Viva Kennedy campaigners Joseph Montoya of New Mexico and Henry B. Gonzalez of Texas, the Mexican American presence in Congress doubled by the mid-1960s to a whopping 4 congressmen. Viva Kennedy was important because it ushered in a new era of investment in national politics for Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans alike. But it only briefly and in limited ways fostered unity among the groups. The civil rights revolutions of the 1960s further thrust Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans into national political life. But again, they did so on different trajectories. As the Black Freedom Movement marched, Democratic presidents in the 1960s struggled to satisfy its urgent demands without losing the support of white working people in the North or their party's traditional base in the white South. They were reluctant to absorb the demands of another national minority group. Yet Mexican American leaders witnessed Black civil rights activism capturing the nation's attention in the decade. And those leaders began to assert their claim that the discrimination their people endured in the Southwest was just as pervasive as any bigotry African Americans suffered in the South. They wondered when Presidents Kennedy and then Johnson would bring the power of Washington to bear on their needs. But despite having won the election by mobilizing Mexican American ethnicity in the Viva Kennedy clubs, Kennedy's administration routinely denied that Mexican Americans possessed unique concerns and claims on the national government. Instead, the White House suggested that this group should seek to melt in the mainstream, much in the manner of European immigrants before them. This disconnect between how Mexican Americans were approached at campaign time and how the sitting government treated them was pronounced, and it was increasingly untenable. Quietly at first, and then ever more loudly, Mexican American leaders began calling their people the country's second largest minority. Puerto Ricans didn't easily fit into this conversation. A people with their own homeland and concentrated in a handful of cities, they could not claim to be a national minority. And while on the national stage, Mexican Americans often viewed African Americans as competitors, Puerto Ricans and African Americans were meaningful allies in New York and elsewhere. This fact helped Puerto Ricans to be included in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. While the act was otherwise focused on ending abuses in the Deep South, a small provision in the law brought an end to New York State's English language literacy test, which was then being used to disfranchise Puerto Ricans whose island education had been conducted in Spanish. The Puerto Rican electorate grew accordingly. At that very same year, 1965, Puerto Ricans and African Americans joined to elect a young Puerto Rican reformer named Herman Badillo to the presidency of the New York City borough of the Bronx. A liberal Democrat who got his start campaigning for John Kennedy in 1960, he became one of the city's only Puerto Rican elected officials. And this was a stepping stone. In 1970, he became the first Puerto Rican elected to Congress from the mainland. Upon arriving in Washington, he would meet none other than a Los Angeles representative named Edward Roybal. From the late 1960s on, these two elected officials took the lead in uniting the diverse communities of Spanish-speaking America into an electoral force. Veterans of the 1960 Kennedy campaign, they knew what it was like to be used by a presidential candidate. And so they set about organizing a new alliance where they would be the ones who called the shots. A watershed moment in the creation of the Latino Vote took place in 1971 when the two congressmen hosted the Unidos Conference. In October of that year, more than 1,000 Latinos came to Washington, D.C. from across the country to establish a first ever national Spanish-speaking coalition. Over a weekend, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans discovered and debated each other's concerns. They socialized and drank and argued. They listened to speeches geared at convincing them to put aside their differences. As they did, they debated distinct understandings of unity. For some, the attraction of a coalition was that it could be a means, a way to achieve shared policy goals of Chicanos and Puerto Ricans. Others, usually leftists, saw coalition as a strategy that they could use to advance each group's specific objectives, including recovery of Mexican people's lands in the Southwest and Puerto Rican independence. For others, however, political unification reflected something more. These individuals saw political unity as a vital first step toward the abandonment of national origin identities such as Mexican American and Puerto Rican, and the crystallization in the United States of a new common sense of Latino peoplehood. This diversity of perspectives on the meaning of unity was strangely beneficial. It enabled enterprising individuals to creatively mine the ambiguity inherent in the idea of coalition. The result was that Unidos Conference participants developed a liberal Spanish-speaking policy agenda. They demanded greater access to anti-poverty programs and equal opportunity in public and private employment. They insisted upon the expansion of bilingual programs. Furthermore, they resolved to create their people's first Washington-based lobbying and political action groups. These were needed to spur government responses to their collective demands. And the conference united on a volatile issue that affected the groups differently. Puerto Ricans, who were all US citizens, helped to defeat a resolution that would have supported penalizing employers who hired undocumented workers. Taken together, this was a first statement of community principles that showed the great possibility of molding Latinos into a progressive force nationwide. The communities also found ways to share power. Mexican Americans greatly outnumbered Puerto Ricans on the mainland, but the Unidos Conference created a 54-member political committee that allocated an equal number of seats to each group. That is, equality of groups was seen as a foundation for unity. But Mexican American and Puerto Rican unity was partly built on exclusion as well. A well-organized cohort of Puerto Ricans moved to prohibit Cubans from representation in the coalition. Defenders of Cuban involvement protested, but they were shouted down by those claiming that Cubans did not share their problems. In a tense atmosphere dedicated to unifying the Spanish-speaking peoples of the United States, Cubans remained a Spanish-speaking people apart. After the conference, Roybal and Badillo continued to make the shift from a national origin politics to a pan-Latino one. In 1972, Roybal and Badillo became the two chairmen of a new Democratic Party Latino caucus. Under their leadership, the caucus defined Latino politics as the Unidos Conference did, meaning the fusion of Mexican, American, and Puerto Rican communities as equals. They deemed this definition of community essential to preventing white politicians from playing Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans off each other. In 1975, the two legislators led the fight to expand the Voting Rights Act. Through their efforts, all Spanish-speaking Americans became a protected language minority in law, and bilingual elections expanded. That same year, Congress passed another Roybal bill. It forced the federal government to publish monthly statistics on the condition of all Spanish origin Americans. This, in turn, paved the way for the creation of the Hispanic category in subsequent censuses. For every census form, medical questionnaire, or school application that would contain this category, Latino communities were further amalgamated. and the image of the nation within all our minds was redrawn. Roybal and Badillo built new pan-Latino organizations too. In 1976, for example, they founded the Congressional Hispanic Caucus to serve as a unifying body for all Latinos and their representatives. By 1976, then, Latino Democrats were full of expectations. Their legislative victories, increasing organizational sophistication, and population growth seemed to position them for power. Former Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter was the Democratic Party's presidential nominee that year. And in a first for a party leader, he addressed Latino delegates at the 1976 Democratic National Convention in New York. Then, the Carter campaign enlisted Latino delegates to join in a National Hispanic Advisory Committee. Buoyed by the Voting Rights Act extension the year before, Latinos mobilized for Carter and delivered margins, most importantly again in Texas, that proved decisive in his victory over President Gerald Ford. In office, however, Carter appeared bent on limiting minority political influence to African Americans. The one Mexican American in Carter's West Wing advertised that he was no White House Chicano, and that the ghettoizing of the White House to cater to so-called special interests was over. Making matters worse, some Carter appointees denied that Latinos were even a real minority. Officials publicly downplayed racism's impact on the group. Their problems were mainly linguistic, the officials asserted. They would be overcome in time. Even as late as 1978, then, Edward Roybal had to protest to a Democratic president that his people were, just like African Americans, a permanent minority. They were not merely, he complained, the latest of immigrant groups. Compounding Latino liberals' frustrations, Carter appeared unwedded to the Democrats' traditional commitment to economic justice. The 1970s were a time of high unemployment and inflation, lots of working class suffering. Many Democrats, Carter among them, were seen to be abandoning the party's progressive economic positions on regulation and government spending. Roybal challenged his party to reject colorblindness and fiscal austerity. He did so by redefining the Latino political community in ways that defended both cultural and economic security. He demanded that Democrats recognize Latinos' uniqueness as a people, arguing that the first of the core values that defined the Latino community was, he said, a strong and vibrant family structure. But he argued that economic security was the social cement which holds the family together. He claimed, too, that full employment policies, affirmative action, and national health insurance were essential to supporting the Latino family. Unemployment, underemployment, and job discrimination, he said, were inherently anti-family. At a time when conservatives invoked the theme of family values to roll back government programs, Roybal creatively fused family and economics, culture and class, to defend his people and the social safety net. Latinos were not the only Democratic constituency chafing under Carter's leadership, and the politics of Latino unity played a central role in a larger liberal rebellion against the president. In 1978, roughly 200 party activists founded a new pan-Hispanic political group, which they called Hispanic American Democrats, HAD. The group pledged to unify the diverse interests of all Hispanics, Chicanos, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and others, into one strong voice. And its leaders vowed to hold the president accountable to his commitments to the poor, to full employment, and to the creation of a national health insurance system. HAD distilled its unifying ambition in a 1980 Hispanic National Platform that reflected key transitions underway in Latino politics. As Latino activists had before, it defined Hispanic positions to include support for bilingual education, civil and voting rights, affirmative action, and policies to bring about full employment. On immigration, HAD too rendered sympathy with the undocumented population a quintessentially Hispanic stance. HAD's innovation was to surround this policy core with a new social liberalism. In the most striking example, for the first time in a national Latino forum, activists made sexual orientation a Hispanic issue. In its call for civil and human rights, had advocated on behalf of Hispanics in the gay community who suffered discrimination twofold due to their mode of lifestyle. The platform decried their victimization at the hands of the police, as well as the ways that discrimination hindered their ability to immigrate. And what truly stands out in the history of Latino politics, had pledged an end to all social, economic, psychological, and legal oppression of the Hispanic gay community. But while HAD expanded the realm of Hispanic issues, it was unclear just how much the group would hold Carter's feet to the fire. HAD came to be controlled by individuals who played a pivotal role in supporting Carter's re-election campaign. Others were party establishment figures who held strong incentives to back the incumbent. And Carter needed all the help he could get. In 1979, Massachusetts Senator Edward Kennedy launched a primary challenge to the sitting president. And he reprised the Viva Kennedy campaign concept, this time with the support of United Farm Worker leader Cesar Chavez and New York's Herman Badillo. And Kennedy took his challenge all the way to the 1980 Democratic National Convention. At the convention, the politics of Hispanic unity worked against Kennedy. The Hispanic American Democrats played a key role in blocking the senator's calls for an open convention, one in which Carter's delegates could switch their votes to him. HAD's chairman, himself a Carter delegate, explained that the decision was to prevent divisiveness among Latinos. The fact is that unity is the #1 concern in our community, and not who will be the candidate, he said. Carter's renomination was secured. The Hispanic American Democrats' defense of Carter revealed that a new generation of Democrats had arrived on the scene. Some were intent on supplanting Edward Roybal, Herman Badillo, and the founders of the Democratic Party's Latino politics. It was particularly notable that the president's supporters used a call for Hispanic political unity to defeat a Kennedy, one of the earliest practitioners of Latino politics. As calls for Latino unity straddled the line between insurgent force and establishment appendage, they revealed just how fully institutionalized the idea of a Hispanic vote had become in the party. The 1980 Carter campaign also showed how US presidents could co-opt the urge for independent Hispanic political power, that they could divide the electorate even as they were helping to summon it into existence. And the forging of Latino politics transformed the Republican Party throughout these decades as well. In the late 1960s, a self-described Hispanic Republican movement began to emerge among Mexican Americans in the Southwest. Its members had powerful allies. Republicans such as Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, and Richard Nixon were among them. These elites envisioned replacing the Republican Party's dwindling African American constituency in northern industrial states with Mexican Americans in the Sun Belt. Conservative Republicans figured Mexican Americans would partner more easily with the party's growing base of white conservatives. There was a sense that both groups could unite in shared resentment over how the civil rights revolution of the 1960s was unfolding. That is, Republicans from the Southwest hoped to activate Mexican American hostility toward African Americans to bring them into the GOP coalition. Many people have heard of the GOP's Southern strategy to convert conservative whites in that region from their Democratic loyalties. What I'm describing here is part of what the Berkeley historian Mark Brilliant has called the Republicans' Southwest strategy. One of the signal moments in the evolution of Hispanic Republicanism came in Ronald Reagan's 1966 run for governor of California. In that race, Reagan scored his Democratic opponent, the incumbent Pat Brown, for neglecting the deserving, humble minority of Mexican Americans, and implicitly for favoring Blacks. The former actor drummed up Mexican American votes in East Los Angeles by focusing on a variety of contemporary resentments. He reserved much of his ire for urban rioting and welfare dependency, issues his audience was clearly expected to associate with African Americans. His slogan was, "Ya basta," enough already. Yet Reagan based his appeal to Mexican Americans on more than what they opposed. As he spoke before Mexican American audiences, the candidate advanced a multicultural conservatism. He found no quarrel with their having ties to Mexico, which he called the land of their beginning, and their yearning to keep alive its distinct customs and language. There was no conflict, Reagan told Mexican Americans, between what made them unique and the other attributes, such as their patriotic wartime sacrifice that confirmed their place of pride in the American story. Reagan's landslide 1966 gubernatorial victory included significant Mexican-American support, perhaps as much as 40% from the traditionally Democratic community. Conservative appeals to Mexican-Americans were seemingly gaining traction. But on the East Coast, something quite different was happening. Liberal Republicans were urging their party to embrace a Northern strategy that included a civil rights agenda and active pursuit of urban minority votes. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, for example, courted Puerto Ricans in a series of elections beginning in 1958. He did so not with a racial backlash message. Rather, he offered Puerto Ricans energetic government to improve housing, fight job discrimination, support higher wages, and offer better medical care, better schools, and an end to police brutality. The same 1966 campaign season, in which Ronald Reagan supporters took to East Los Angeles, Governor Rockefeller could be seen marching up New York's Fifth Avenue in the city's Puerto Rican parade. Shouting to the crowd in Spanish, both arms raised in the air, Rockefeller declared his support for an expansion of the welfare state in urban America. As the crowd chanted for the man they called El Rocky, they might have received campaign flyers touting the governor's expansive implementation of the Medicaid program, his support for college financial aid, low-income housing, the nation's first state minimum wage law, as well as his commitment to fight a war without quarter against drugs. When all was said and done, and his 1966 re-election secured, Rockefeller's backers claimed to have won 50% support in New York's Spanish-speaking precincts. The lesson to them was clear. A liberal message could indeed convince Latino Democrats to cross party lines to vote for a Republican. To put these two regions of the country together, then, would be tricky. Republicans of differing ideological stripes valued Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans for different purposes, which worked against pan-Hispanic consolidation in the GOP. To complicate matters, Democrats were, as I've mentioned, creating new alliances to demand that the government recognize all Spanish-speaking people as one. It fell to Richard Nixon, elected president in 1968, to make sense of the situation. Nixon had grown up in Southern California and claimed a fondness for Mexican Americans. Like fellow Southwesterners Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan before him, Nixon's outreach to Mexican Americans rested significantly on exploiting racial animus. For example, in his first year, 1969, Nixon's White House investigated the federal government's own civil rights watchdogs for what they called possible discrimination against Mexican Americans. The White House badgered federal agencies for not hiring more Mexican Americans and for focusing on Black concerns instead. And it publicized this racial score settling to Mexican American leaders. Some Republicans wanted to expand their party's Mexican American strategy to include Puerto Ricans too. Yet Nixon saw Puerto Ricans as diehard liberals who had no place in his party going forward. Race was another factor working against Puerto Ricans as far as the GOP was concerned. According to one Republican operative, some Puerto Ricans are Black, and no one knows how many. Therefore, Nixon's strategy of fomenting Black-brown rivalry would not work with them, nor would GOP attacks on the use of busing to promote school integration. Thus, as president, Nixon faced a problem: how to reconcile his desire to win over middle-class Mexican Americans with the growing expectation that all Spanish-speaking Americans belong to one constituency. His White House aides even gave a name to this new dilemma they confronted. They called it the Spanish-speaking concept. Well, the Nixon White House solved its problem in two steps. First, it would publicly embrace the Spanish-speaking concept, treating Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans as members of one group. But second, it would insulate the Mexican American middle class from political adulteration by Puerto Ricans. Indeed, Nixon solved his problem by creating programs that on their surface treated Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans as equal members of one group. For instance, he created a so-called brown capitalism program. It was aimed at building up a small Latino business elite from coast to coast. Its leader was a Mexican-American financial consultant named Benjamin Francis. Born in a railroad boxcar in Indiana, he claimed to have become a millionaire in California through education and his embrace of free enterprise. While claiming to serve all Spanish-speaking Americans, beneath the surface of Fernandez's national operation, it was obvious that the Nixon administration was playing favorites. More than 1/3 of federal small business financing under Nixon went to Miami, the capital of Cuban America. Of the remainder, 3/4 went to the Southwest. This was a virtual guarantee that Puerto Ricans would receive only a small benefit from the program. As he worked to obscure this unequal treatment, Fernandez was not the only Mexican-American spokesperson appointed by the Nixon administration in the quest to carry the message of middle-class ethnic inclusion to the Spanish-speaking public. The White House's PR masterstroke was a Los Angeles Mexican food manufacturer named Romana Bañuelos. Nixon nominated her in September of 1971 to be Treasurer of the United States. She was a remarkable story. Without even a high school diploma, she had turned a home-based tortilla venture into a multi-million-dollar Mexican food empire. Along with a group of Mexican-American campaign operatives that called themselves the Brown Mafia, Bañuelos was a fixture in Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. She and other Mexican-American appointees of Nixon told stories of rising from farm labor to corporate boardrooms through hard work and education. In their view, these were just the values of Spanish-speaking Americans, at last recognized in American life thanks to Richard Nixon. Equating Latino identity with upward mobility and capitalism, Bañuelos handed out signed $1 bills at every campaign rally. In 1972, Nixon himself went to South Texas to share this message that any individual could go to the top in the Nixon administration, and that this was to be taken as a sign of group progress. Behind the scenes, the GOP's Spanish-speaking campaign kicked into high gear. As part of its plan to capture the Spanish-speaking vote, the Brown Mafia publicized Nixon's record of high appointments of Mexican Americans. It distributed federal grants and patronage jobs to Nixon supporters and punished those deemed disloyal to the president. And while most of its work was in the Southwest, the Brown Mafia saw a benefit in fostering the image of a national Spanish-speaking constituency. It even helped launch a new national magazine called La Luz, The Light, which was the Hispanic version of Ebony, all in exchange for favorable stories about the administration. Even as it promoted the image of a national Hispanic community, the Brown Mafia knew Nixon's priority was to win over Mexican Americans. It therefore ruthlessly segmented the electorate. A polling analysis from the summer of 1972 began this way. A New York Puerto Rican does not look like a promising constituent for anybody. And calling a positive campaign in New York hopeless, it recommended an effort to denigrate the opposition and keep the electorate home, leaving them with no candidate. In its nominal Spanish-speaking campaign, the Brown Mafia assigned no one to drive Puerto Rican turnout, nor did it run Spanish-language television ads in New York, devoting those funds to California instead. The White House's segmenting of Latino voters became known just before Election Day, but commentators still credited the emerging Spanish-speaking vote for helping Nixon take 49 states against the Democrat George McGovern. They reported that Nixon won nearly 1/3 of this national electorate, which was then a modern record for a Republican. The president netted much higher percentages still in conservative Texas and Florida. It was a victory that Hispanic Republicans would celebrate for years to come. At the same time, the campaign also reinforced a pattern that would continue. The US president was just as willing to divide Latino constituencies from one another as he was to promote their solidarity. In the aftermath of the 1972 campaign, and as the Watergate scandal forced Nixon from office, Hispanic activists in the Republican Party learned they couldn't trust the Spanish-speaking concept to the president. And so, in 1974, GOP activists and elected officials tried to unite their factions. Working with a Republican Party chairman named George H.W. Bush, they formed a new organization called the Republican National Hispanic Assembly. It was headed by Benjamin Fernandez, who had led the Brown Capitalism program under Nixon. A Mexican-American, Fernandez built this national Republican organization on a similar class-conscious formula. He enlisted businessmen, medical doctors, and other professionals to be the face of Hispanic Republicanism. Like Romana Bañuelos, members of the assembly espoused an ethnic individualism that equated their personal economic success with Hispanic progress. While Fernandez tried to forge an influential place for Hispanics within a multicultural GOP, the party's conservative activists made it difficult. Figures associated with the new right attacked affirmative action. They vowed to cut minority small business programs. But both were the lifeblood of recruiting moderate Hispanics to the GOP. Undocumented immigration from Mexico added to Republicans' challenges. Republican President Gerald R. Ford wanted to reach out to Mexican Americans, but often pandered to anti-immigrant sentiment in an effort to cover his right flank. The GOP Hispanic coalition was also evolving. The Watergate affair had thrust the Cuban exile community firmly into US domestic politics. Cubans made up the core of those arrested during the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the summer of 1972. And the prolonged linkage between Nixon's Watergate crimes and Cuban America stimulated many Cubans to a fervent defense of the president. More Cubans were then giving up hope of returning to the island as well. And their rising rates of naturalization throughout the 1970s increased Cuban participation in the US political system even more. And whether they too belonged to the Latino vote was a question. One important Cuban American Republican spoke for many when she said no and repudiated the party's Hispanic assembly. The Cubans are unlike other Spanish-speaking ethnics with whom they are consistently and wrongly grouped, the leader claimed. Ben Fernandez's Washington-based Mexican clique, as she called it, did not represent Cubans. To prove his people's relevance to the future of the party, Fernandez launched his own campaign for the Republican presidential nomination in 1980. The candidate espoused an eclectic Hispanic conservatism. He rejected colorblindness, insisting that government aid, particularly to support free enterprise, was essential to Hispanic advancement. Yet he also adopted the right's critique of taxes and economic regulation. And he trumpeted an aggressive anti-communist foreign policy. He proposed amnesty for undocumented immigrants, but called for intensified border enforcement. Campaigning as a business expert who arose from poverty to become a millionaire, he appears to have made little attempt to capitalize upon social issues, such as abortion or gay rights. Fernandez's proudly ethnic and conservative campaign was a momentary sensation, yet it soon stalled out. Not only did he fail to attract garden variety Republicans, a dismal showing in the early Puerto Rico primary, which was won by George H.W. Bush, suggested the limits of his Hispanic appeal. The stage was set for a new era in GOP Hispanic politics. When Ronald Reagan triumphed over Jimmy Carter in the 1980 general election, his advisors believed he had done so with some 36% of the Hispanic vote. Aides wondered how to maintain these levels of support while the new administration was attacking or slashing funding for affirmative action, bilingual education, minority business aid, and voting rights. After all, these were the traditional means by which the GOP had attempted to convert Hispanic voters. But Reagan's ambition was less to convert a Hispanic electorate than to remake it. And to remake the Hispanic electorate, Reagan spurred a changing of the guard in the Hispanic Republican movement. His new administration denied patronage jobs and White House access to the Hispanic Assembly and its moderate Mexican-American leadership. Instead, the White House directed jobs and influence to Cubans. In 1982, the White House empowered Cuban Americans to oust Mexican Americans from Hispanic Assembly leadership positions. At the group's 1983 conclave in Dallas, a well-organized slate of Cuban Americans, led by Reagan's ally, Dr. Tirso del Junco, swept into nearly every assembly leadership post. They even won offices in Texas and the Northeast, traditionally reserved for Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, respectively. The Cubans basked in Reagan's words of encouragement and support. Mexican Americans walked out in protest. Cubans would set the direction of GOP Hispanic strategy going forward in lockstep with Reaganism. The Cuban leaders kept a good deal of the racial polarization strategy they inherited, but they rejected the use of expansive government and affirmative action as tools for party building. Tirso del Junco made clear the new direction. The new Hispanic Assembly chairman argued that there would be no further need for the GOP to reach out to those he called low-status Hispanics. Nor should the party try to win over those Hispanics he called ideologically committed to economic protection programs authored by the Democrats. Del Junco advocated creating new Hispanic issues aligned with the aims of the conservative movement. In this new Hispanic vision, an aggressive and interventionist foreign policy abroad was to be married to punitive crime policy, restrictions on abortion, support for school prayer, and aid to parochial schools. Tirso del Junco addressed the 1984 Republican National Convention that renominated Ronald Reagan. His remarks underscored how shifts in power within a national party could recast an entire electorate's public image. Speaking in the name of Hispanic Americans, Del Junco denounced liberal economic and social policy as antithetical to his people's pride and independence. And he credited Reagan with precipitating a rebirth of traditional religious family values. He cited the president's support for school prayer, tax credits for religious education, and limits on abortion. Del Junco then returned to one of Latino politics' earliest notions. This was that the US Hispanic population had a unique role to play in safeguarding freedom in the hemisphere. His people knew well, he said, the shattered illusions of revolution in Cuba and elsewhere. They stood with the American president and with our brothers and sisters in Central America, then resisting leftist forces. A quarter of a century before, that same struggle for freedom had animated some to join the Viva Kennedy campaign. Then, the members of this nascent constituency had little national presence, few notions of even what to call themselves, but a basic commitment to civil rights and liberal economic reform. In 1984, however, Del Junco could express this Cold War ethnic patriotism on behalf of the most conservative president of his lifetime. He could fuse it to an anti-civil rights and anti-government economic agenda, and he could do so in the name of a people. In Del Junco's telling, his people's support for Reagan came naturally. They gave it, he said, as Hispanics. By the early 1980s, then, what constituted Latino or Hispanic issues was shown to be extraordinarily malleable. And leaders of both parties, seeking 270 electoral college votes, had demonstrated that they were just as willing to disorganize this emerging constituency as they were to unite it. The Latino vote was an accepted fact. Latino power was still very much in the making. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Terrific. Thank you, Ben, for that wonderful exposition of the themes of your book. Just a reminder to our audience, please do use the Q&A function on the bottom right hand of your Zoom screen to submit questions. Let me take the chair's prerogative, Ben, and lead off by asking a rather general question about the genesis of the project. It's obviously a long road from a dissertation prospectus to a dissertation, and in turn from a dissertation to a book. But on that road, which findings most surprised you as you explored the archive?
That's a great question. So it was a long story, and it wasn't supposed to be this book. But I was looking at many of these dynamics as I saw them occurring in Washington, D.C., where there was no one Mexican American community that was numerically dominant, Puerto Ricans neither. There were a good number of Salvadorans, but it was really a multinational Latino community. And I was curious about how those different communities came together to wield power, or how they negotiated their differences. And I was doing keyword searches in local newspaper, and this name Richard Nixon kept coming up when I put in the terms that the local activists were using, and then I would just get a bunch of stories that involved the Nixon administration. And it occurred to me that the very processes that I imagined were happening locally were happening at the national level. And I began to follow that more, and lo and behold, a story of Republican outreach, a story of that I had not known existed, and everything else that you hear. So that was kind of how it happened. It was not where I was looking.
I understand. There's a question here from my old friend Ramon Gutierrez. It's great to see you in the audience, Ramon. He's asking, do religious differences among Hispanics and Latinos, that is Catholics, Protestants and evangelicals, play into voting identities? So how important is religion in this story?
I'm sorry, Steve, it's all frozen for me.
Oh dear. Can everybody else hear me? Can you hear me now?
Ben, I think we might have had a blip in your internet. Can you hear us now?
Yeah, I've not heard much in the last couple of seconds.
Okay, so just to reiterate the question.
Now I'm good.
Ramon Gutierrez, who was a distinguished fellow at the Huntington a few years ago, asks, do religious differences amongst Hispanics and Latinos, that is Catholics, Protestants and evangelicals, play into voting identities? What's the role of religion in this story?
Yeah, certainly it was a feature of the Nixon appeal to recognize the Catholicism of the Mexican American electorate. And in many ways, if looking in the correspondence, they're always talking about, how can we cultivate relationships among priests and have a kind of a conservative religious alternative to a lot of the religious energy that existed in the farm worker movement. But it was complicated because the Republicans' Catholic appeal was really concentrated in the urban industrial states of the Midwest and the North. This was a white ethnic appeal. So, and the tools of reaching out to white ethnic Catholics, policy tools were not the same policy tools that were used to reach out to Latino Catholics. So affirmative action in the latter case and minority business programs, that was how loyalty of a Catholic constituency was cultivated in addition to sort of church relations. In the Carter administration, Carter was seen as having a Catholic problem as well. And the campaign really required a lot of education as to how to balance Latino religiosity with the sort of just minority identities. And I think from the Democratic side overall in the period I study, this was an underdeveloped theme. It was piety was discussed by political figures of both parties, not in any really substantive way, but as a way of describing this kind of tendency towards social conformity, toward peacefulness, which was intended to be a contrast to how many politicians talked about African Americans. So in other words, Latino religiosity was a way of explaining almost docility and therefore deservingness of public policy attention. And again, it had this sort of bank shot effect at disparaging African Americans as well.
Interesting, thank you. To change tack slightly, Juana Mora asks about the Latino youth vote and whether you would share your views on how the younger generation of Latino voters will behave differently than their predecessors.
Yeah, I think we're really getting a chance to appreciate that in this election. I was stunned to find out that half of the Latino electorate in this past election was not eligible, mostly by age, to vote in the 2008 elections.
Wow.
So this is a stunning fact that so much of the Latino electorate is aging in and more to come. So I think, and is, as a general rule, more progressive than their parents. I think you can expect to see, as we started to see in the tail end of my talk in my book, just hard debates about sexual orientation and gender identity that older generations don't necessarily feel so equipped to have or don't want to have. The Los Angeles Times op-ed that Steve referenced, in which I wrote about the use of the term Latinx, as an example of one of these kind of controversies where there seems to be kind of some generational split, but also gender splits. So I think, we have to be talking about generation and gender and national origin and location kind of all at the same time.
Right, thank you. One question here asks you to put your political consultant's hat on. How can African American and Latino political groups avoid being pitted against each other as an election strategy by political parties? I mean, that's such a consistent theme in your talk and in your book, the relentless divide and rule strategy that both parties adopted. So how can that be forestalled or preempted or combated?
Well, you know, I'm pretty optimistic about this, because something I didn't really talk about, maybe more optimistic than I should be, but in the foundational years of the political careers of some of the people I write about in the book, Edward Roybal, Herman Badillo, Henry B. Gonzalez, when they were operating as local political figures, city council, state elected from small state legislative districts, people running for mayor, as outsiders, they were the product of and the builders of multiracial coalitions.
Right.
So the figures who created Latino politics were coalition builders, building a Latino coalition, but they had ample experience forging alliances with African Americans, with progressive whites, with Jews, and other people who were kind of still, on the margins of society in the middle third of the 20th century. And it's that localism that I think is so important. And it seems to me that, well, if we think about the project of unifying across the great space of the United States put a tremendous amount of strain on Latino political leaders and invited some of this hostility with African Americans. But local organizing doesn't have as many moving pieces, and it's got different ones. But it seems to suggest that common interests, and lots of organizations are doing this. If you look at what's happened in Georgia too, with how Fair Fight has structured Black-Brown relations, and Stacey Abrams, there are ample roadmaps for a focus on Latino politics that de-emphasizes the urgency of Latino unity and is more kind of issue-based and frankly coalitional. That's really important, to be open that what's happening is coalitions and people have different interests, but they can align them. So.
Thank you. So just to pick up on that theme of localism, Becky Nicolaides, hello Becky, I hope you're well, asks, beyond spatial dimensions of region, did you find any meaningful patterns of Latino political identity by urban, suburban, and rural residents over time?
It was definitely the case that political strategists were very mindful of Mexican-American suburbanization, and the belief that that was where, in Texas, for instance, that was where Republicans would get votes, in the suburbs. Republicans sent these campers or recreational vehicles out to shopping center parking lots in the outer rings in San Antonio, and cultivated voters, Latino voters, in that fashion. And the stain from the Republican perspective on Puerto Ricans was their profound urbanness. That they were the Latinos that were associated with the urban crisis. They were the poor in Republican eyes. They were the welfare dependent, and they were not part of the sort of Sunbelt future sketched out by Kevin Phillips and other Republican strategists. So there is a mindfulness of that. Rural America, in the period I study, is not identified as a key place for Latino targeting, but an interesting anecdote I can share is that goes to Mexican American and Puerto Rican relations. The great success of the United Farm Workers movement created a great sort of public relations success, created an image in many minds of Mexican peoples as being rural, and not being urban as they were by that point in American history. And so that idea that the Mexican was the farm worker was a sticking point for Puerto Rican activists who had just kind of only learned what they learned about Mexican people from the farm worker movement. And so there had to be some education there. We're urban. We have these issues that all urban people face, and we deal with the police in our neighborhoods, and we deal with municipal exclusion and failing schools and so on. So those are kind of three ways in which those zones that you're talking about factored in this book.
Terrific, thank you. So we'll take one last question. This is from Roberta Martinez, and it goes back to relationships between African American and Hispanic communities. She notes that there's an increase in marriages and long-term relationships between members of those ethnic groups. Their children will have an intersectional experience that is different and in some ways new. Do you see those dynamics, those demographic dynamics playing out in voting behavior in the future?
I would say that we're at an exciting moment when more and more people in positive ways are carving out space within the Latino community, political community for Afro-Latinos more generally.
Right.
And that ongoing discussion about what that identity means, or Afro-Latinx, or however it's going to be understood, is so crucial with that, because I think probably in times past, there's people are always asked to be in one box or another, and I think that, as others have noted, one of the important challenges of Latino presence, but also Latino political action in the country, is to disturb this black-white binary and to create challenges to thinking about race in such fixed fashions. So I guess I don't have a crystal ball on that one, but I'm excited about a real frank discussion about how those intersectional realities can be honored by the political system, because they're generally seen as aberrant in the period that I study. It's right. Like the Black Puerto Ricans, that's just a problem, and we're just going to pretend that that's just, we're not going to have anything to do with that, rather than confront it.
Right. Well, it's a great tribute to the topicality of the book, that it raises all these issues in such interesting and provocative ways. So thank you, everybody, for your questions, and thank you, Ben, for answering them so deftly.
Thank you so much.
We should draw the intellectual exchange to a close now in order to present you with your prize. So to do so, on behalf of the Huntington, let me introduce the Avery Director of the Library, Sandy Brooke. Sandy, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Well, Ben, everyone has left me the very best part of the evening. And that is simply to say, on behalf of the Shapiro Center for American History and Culture at the Huntington, it's my honor and true pleasure to officially present you with the 2021 and the inaugural Shapiro Book Prize. In addition to the $10,000 cash award that comes with the prize, we wanted you to have a material memento of this occasion. And at the heart of the Shapiro Center are the Huntington's extraordinary American collections, and a conviction that library and archival materials are a fulcrum for understanding the past and informing our shared future. So instead of a medal or a trophy, we could think of nothing more apt than to present the winner with a facsimile of a document from the Huntington's collections chosen by our curators that speak to their research. So winging its way to you is a framed facsimile of the item shown here, which is from the Gloria Molina Papers, which is a vast archive, 1,277 boxes in all, of the first Latina elected to the California State Legislature, the LA City Council, and to the LA County Board of Supervisors, a trifecta. Gloria Molina gave her papers to the Huntington in 2014, and they are a true goldmine for Los Angeles history. This ephemeral document from box 911 is an invitation for a 1995 reception sponsored by the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project and its sister organization, the Southwest Voter Research Institute. SVREP, as I'm sure you know better than all of us, is the oldest Latino voter registration nonprofit. And it has trained 150,000 Latino leaders, won 210 voting rights lawsuits, and registered 2.7 million Latino voters. Its motto shown here is "Su voto es su voz." Your vote is your voice. The invitation features a drawing by Esteban Torres, renowned labor organizer and activist, ambassador to UNESCO, and 8-term California representative to the US House of Representatives. And as if those accomplishments were not enough, Esteban has over the years used his considerable gifts as a draftsman, what I would call his secret superpower, to capture the events, the characters, and passions of the history that he has helped to shape. So Ben, we hope you will enjoy this little memento, and especially that we will be able to welcome you to the Huntington's reading rooms in person in the not so distant future. And so please accept our warm congratulations on winning the 2021 Shapiro Book Prize.
Thank you very much, Sandra. It's such an incredible honor, and what an incredibly thoughtful piece of art. So thank you again to the Shapiro family and to everyone at the Huntington. It's just a dream come true.
It's been a great pleasure. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Sandy, and congratulations, Ben. So to close our program, I'm delighted to say that the National Book Award winning and Pulitzer Prize nominated historian Nathaniel Philbrick has accepted our invitation to offer a tribute to Susan and Dennis Shapiro. Best known, of course, as the author of In the Heart of the Sea, Nat is not only, like the Shapiros, a collector, but a close friend of Susan and Dennis, which makes his words all the more appropriate on this momentous occasion. So please welcome Nathaniel Philbrick.
Hello, my name is Nathaniel Philbrick. I'm a longtime friend of both Dennis and Susan Shapiro, and it's a real pleasure to speak here with you about the Shapiro Center of American History and Culture at the Huntington Library. But first, I'd like to issue my congratulations to Benjamin Francis-Fallon for winning the Shapiro Prize in History, a really distinguished honor and a wonderful book, The Rise of the Latino Vote. As I said earlier, I've known Dennis and Susan for a long time. I think it's running on 25 years. I live on Nantucket Island, and Dennis and Susan have a place on Nantucket, and we both are we're all sailors. And so we initially got to know each other on the water, but it's really been through history that my friendship with Dennis and Susan has broadened. Dennis is a fascinating individual, quietly intelligent, an inventor, an entrepreneur who has also shown a really probing talent for finding documents that are important to the history of America, particularly when it comes to our American presidents. I know Dennis is very interested in the relationship between John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams. And over the years, he's been collecting documents related to not only their correspondence to other presidents, and including John's wife and John Quincy Adams' mother, Abigail Adams. But what really makes what the Shapiros have done at the Huntington Library so unique is that they have created a center, not of bricks and mortar, but which will promote programming and the library's online presence. The library has an unparalleled collection of manuscripts and other documents and artifacts. But as this pandemic world is showing for scholars, the frustrating thing is that you can't necessarily always get to these places. But making these documents more accessible online will be a huge service, just one of the many things accomplished by the Shapiro Center. And, you know, the other thing that really makes me excited about the Shapiro's plans with this is that Dennis has been a collector for all these years. And libraries such as the Huntington are composed of collections brought to the library by collectors. And Dennis wants to create a center to investigate the relationship between collectors and collections. And as a historian, I'm always on the lookout for things that have not made it into the collections. And so to have relationships with collectors and historians, I think is one of the real breakthrough ambitions of the Shapiro Center. And so in closing, I just want to thank Dennis and Susan for what they have done at the Huntington Library, but most of all for their friendship and example. Thank you.
Thank you, Nat. I know that you couldn't join us in person, so it was wonderful to hear your pre-recorded tribute. I'd like to thank our audience for being with us this evening. Please join me in thanking Susan and Dennis Shapiro for making this remarkable award possible, and in congratulating Ben Francis-Fallon on being its first recipient. We look forward to running the next competition for the Shapiro Book Prize in 2022 and announcing its winner early in 2023. Good night, everybody. Please be kind to yourselves and to one another.